Welcome back to the 2020 Kentucky Bourbon Festival, the virtual edition. My name is Steve Coombs. I'm your host for this afternoon's event. We've been slowly working our way through the 5 stages of whiskey making. In fact, we call it the art of whiskey making. The second stage we're going to talk about today is distillation. And the best thing that I can do for the viewers at home is to let the experts start speaking. And with me this afternoon, I have Conor O'Driscoll, who is the master distiller at Heaven Hill. And next to him is Denny Potter, master distiller at Maker's Mark. Welcome, guys.
Hi, Steve. Good to be
Thanks
here.
for coming. We're all squinting in the sun, and you could be outside and doing something else rather than hanging here with me.
This is all right.
Here they are. They
We're
have
hanging
better
here
things.
drinking whiskey. It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Drinking, as we say.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about, which parts of whiskey making influences the flavor the most, and we're going to kind of dissect that a little bit with questions about distilling specifically. These guys have not had these questions beforehand to look at, but I gather you're smart enough to answer them on the spot. So let's just jump in with some simple stuff. Who wants to define simply what distilling is for the audience? Pick me. What do you want to do? What's the simplest way if an amateur came up and said, what does it really mean to distill?
Is the separation of components based on their differing boiling points.
Spoken like the chemical engineer you are. Is that right?
Exactly.
You got a better one?
I mean, it's pretty much all based in that. I mean, it's, just the process of creating flavor from grain. And I mean, distillation is, for the most part, a solid separator. And then, just trying to refine it to that profile you want on your distillate before it goes in the barrel.
Do you find when people come on tours or get to go see the process with you that they have that aha moment that it's exciting to say, oh, that's what you mean by the separation, and that's what's happening?
Mostly the aha moment is, it's crystal clear. I thought whiskey was brown.
Yeah.
It's like we'll get to that bit later.
Yeah, it is amazing that how many people that kind of takes by surprise.
Well, it of course is much more complex than the simple explanations that you gave it. Is it safe to say that distillation is probably the most labor-intense and science-intense part of the process, or am I making an assumption here that's not fair?
It's probably the most equipment-intense anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, you need a still or a set of stills doing your pot or column, and you need steam, so you need a boiler, and you need a condenser, so you need a cooler, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's where you make the whiskey from the beer, so it's what sets us apart from breweries.
Is it the most intense part too? I mean, really to operate the machinery?
Of course, Denny. Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
we'll
say
master
that.
distillers. Yeah,
for sure. Distillation, honestly, is especially if you're doing continuous, it's the startup and the shutdown, right? So making sure startup is where you're going to have the bulk of any issues, and it's just kind of getting into that. Doing it so many times, whether that's learning from somebody else or us having to train people to do the same thing. But typically, when you get up to that steady state, it's, there's not a lot to it unless power goes out, boiler goes down, which it does. It's really trying to be prepared for those things that don't happen very often. But when they do, you got to be ready.
I think you told me one time when I went to interview you at the distillery just after Christmas shutdown, and you just said, things, were creaking and popping and not doing what they're supposed to do. And a kind of a standard statement in distilleries is they're made to run. Yep. They don't like to sit idle, and they certainly don't like to be restarted. Right?
No, like Denny said, once you get them up and running, keeping them at that steady state is where they like to be. And stills are designed to make at a continuous point. So if you can keep it as close to that and keep it as steady to that, you'll get a cleaner distillate, a more consistent distillate, which is going to make a better whiskey in the long run.
And Denny, you said to me before, you kind of break down in your mind by percentage what part of the process accounts for X, Y, Z or percentage of the whole process. And distillation is kind of a narrow part of that for you. Is that right? Or do you want to give your percentage breakdown?
It's, the percentage is very, very, very subjective, right? I mean, most people, you don't really hear people talk about how much mash or distillation. It's mainly, they'll say, well, maturation 60%. You kind of hear that a lot. From the distillation side, I mean, obviously, it's impossible to give it a percentage. You can adjust the taste profile, but, I think mashing and yeast probably has, mashing, fermentation, and yeast has more of an impact than actually distillation, because you can tweak that. I mean, you can actually tweak that, whereas those other things that you do, you can't necessarily tweak those. I mean, for the most part, it is what it is. But
would you agree with that, Colin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's clearly a contributor, but it's not the big contributor. Maturation, the time in the barrel, in the warehouse, that's the big one. And then, are you using wheat? Are you using rye as your flavor grain? How long do you ferment? What is your yeast to? They're the big hitters. But then, when you distill your fermented beer, what you take off and what you leave behind is going to have an impact. But probably, if you want a percent, what, 15, 10?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe 10%.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely crucial, that 10%, right? I mean,
yeah.
You don't have it without.
Yeah, that becomes your profile, right? I mean, I think, like for us at Makers, I mean, we typically run one mash bill, and pretty much every expression we have is born out of that mash bill or classic maker. So it's important for us to dial that in, to get that still up and running, take that heads cut, and then maintain it around 65% out of the doubler. And for us, if we do that, we know we're going to have a very consistent distillate. And if not, then it's usually something else, right? Maybe we had an issue in fermentation. Maybe there was an issue with the incoming grain. But if you're coming off at 65% and your profile's off a little bit, it's rarely distillation. It's probably going to be one of the other things.
And I think we've talked about this before, that it is truly a garbage in, garbage out thing that you cannot correct bad mash with distillation, bad fermentation.
On a certain level, I mean, you don't want to rely on it to cover your sins, because you're not going to cover your sins. But, if the fermentation has gone south, the distillate will not be that good. But you take care of the yeast, take care of the fermentation, and run the still smoothly, you're going to have a good distillate.
Right. Clean water, right? Clean grain. I mean, if those are off, then that, a lot of times can carry through.
Well, you had mentioned a doubler, so let's talk a little bit about that. In fact, there's one right behind you. And you've had experience working on both types of stills, so we're going to get to talk
Pots,
to that.
double, and
Yeah, exactly. So
all three styles.
So you said pot still, column still, and what was the other?
So column still with a thumper and a column still with a doubler. Subtly yet important.
But you've also done pot stills.
Pot stills, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so since that's the most basic of all stills, talk about that, Conor.
So the pot still, you charge it with beer, and you run it. You distill all the alcohol off, and then you stop, and you dump out the stillage, and you recharge it again, and you do it again. So it's a batch process. And typically, you need at least 2, and sometimes 3. Irish whiskey is typically triple distilled. Scotch is typically double distilled. But to get it up to the proof you want and get it to the character that you want, you've got to distill it several times. At its simplest, then, a column still is a whole bunch of pot stills stacked on top of each other, and it runs continuously. You feed it beer about 2/3 of the way up, you feed it steam at the bottom, you take distillate off the top, and stillage comes out the bottom. And depending on how tall it is and where you feed and where you do all the other things, you can run it to have your distillate come off at 120 proof, 140 proof, 130 proof, depending. And that's what brings in your house style. I mean, what character of whiskey are you trying to make? And you make those choices early, and hopefully you make good choices, you make a good distillate, and you're like, that's our house style, we're sticking with it.
Talk about what you're taking off the still, Denny, the heads, hearts, and tails cuts.
Yeah, I mean, it's just obviously it's different congeners, different components that boil off at different temperatures. So in order to get a very consistent distillate, you need to make sure you're taking kind of that middle cut. So when you're starting up, a lot of times you're still, because if you're not putting the beer feed in yet, you're going to be blowing steam right through it, so it's going to start out hot. So you really want to get to a point where that vapor temperature at the top of the column still is running very steady, so that the components that are evaporating are very consistent, right? Not just in what they are, but also the quantity that they come off at. So that's really what helps you drive the consistency, and that's why continuous distillation is very consistent. But it's
why
maintaining.
Those component parts are so important. Some get to stay and some get thrown out. Why is that?
Yeah, and it is a matter of preference, right? I mean, they just they can have very distinct tastes, mouthfeels, other things that exist within that distillate. Like a vodka, they want to come off at obviously a very high proof, but vodkas are known for no taste, no odor, right? So for us, we want to make sure that we're leaving behind some of that character that comes from the grain. So you kind of adjust what your proof is going to be, or I'm sorry, your vapor temperature is going to be, so that equates to a certain proof, so you hold on to that profile. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, just like pot distillation, distillate from pot distillation will taste quite a bit different from continuous distillation because it's more of a, they don't have the continuous, so when you're taking your cuts, it can be, you know, a little bit harder to dial that in.
And that's a good point, actually. So the, you know, continuous still run properly gives you whiskey at 140 proof or 130 proof, whatever it is. So whatever's coming over there is pretty consistent, like Denny just explained. In a batch pot still, it starts off with nothing, it kind of ramps up and then tails off, the alcohol content. So the stuff that's coming over with the alcohol along that curve is very different at each point. So where you take your cuts is critically important. So the stuff that comes off first is very light, very floral. The stuff that comes off...
But very poisonous as well.
No,
so you're
well, you shouldn't
methanol
have. You shouldn't really
right,
have methanol.
That's getting thrown away.
No, if you run your fermentation right, you don't have methanol.
You won't have an issue.
And we're all about running fermentation right.
Of course.
But no, they are the very light, the things that boil first. So the light, floral, very ephemeral.
And we're into the heart's cut at this point.
No, that's the head. So
the head still.
And then, so where you, if you take a very small head cut, then you get a lot of those lighter flavors in your whiskey. Then you get into the body of it, and all the other stuff is coming over. And then the tail cut are all the bigger molecules, the longer chain alcohols, the fatty acids, and the ones that have, you know, if you smell the tails cut on a beer still, they tend to have cabbagey or, you know, just kind of funky odors.
What, cardboard I hear?
Yeah, I mean, just not good whiskey flavors. So you take your tail cut to leave those behind, and then you keep the stuff that's got the right balance of the bigger, beefier flavors and the lighter, more ephemeral ones.
Since you've played with both, well, worked with, not played with, both kinds of stills, do you have any preference versus?
You know, I get asked this a lot. It was like, you know, the Scotch snobs tend to say that, you know, only pot stills can make good whiskey. And no, there's great whiskey made on pot stills and crappy whiskey made on pot stills. There's great whiskey made on column stills and crappy whiskey made on column stills. It's how it's run, how it's fermented, how it's made, and you know, that's where it comes down to it. You know, and I would hate to cut myself off and say I'm only going to drink this type of whiskey because you're cutting out everything else. So.
Right.
Let's step a little bit outside of distillation for a second, because both of you guys work with some pretty simple mash bills. Every Heaven Hill bourbon comes from the single mash bill, correct?
5 mash bills.
Well, 5 mash bills total.
So two bourbons. We got a wheated bourbon and a rye bourbon. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, but and all come from one mash bill at Maker's Mark, correct?
Correct. Yes.
But you guys have to figure out, especially you. I mean, they all come off as bourbon, and they all end up as different.
So when we make, so the one you're referring to basically is HH Reg, which is our Heaven Hill regular. It's 78% corn, 10% rye, 12% malted barley, and that's 90% of what we make. And when we make it at the distillery, we're making it today, we're not making Evan Williams or Elijah Craig or JW Dant or any of the other brands that we make. We're making HH Reg. That's going in a new charred white oak barrel at 100, well, we distill it at 140 proof, enter it at 125, and we put it away. And then we wait. And when it's mature, we decide what brand it's going to be. So I don't specifically make brands at the distillery. We just make great new make whiskey.
Does that make life any easier? Did you just have to hit that one target?
Right. I mean, easy? Is it easy? I mean, yes. I mean, we're making whiskey. It's fun, you know. So yes, it's easy. I mean, it's the devil is very much in the details. I mean, you run the distillery right, and it's really not rocket science, but there are 1,000,000,001 details to attend to every day, which is why we, you know, obviously I got a great team up there. They're making the whiskey right now, so.
And in both cases, you guys have multiple expressions that come from the same distillate, but it doesn't change there. It changes in aging.
Yep.
Aging and mingling and all that other kind of stuff, especially for you guys. You guys keep adding new programs, new lines.
Most of pretty much everything we do that isn't, you know, classic makers, which is, you know, what we started doing back in 1954, is either a wood finishing, like with the 46 or the Private Select program, which is the barrel program, the wood finishing releases that we do, or the cast strength, which is the bottle that's out right now. So that's just kind of your purest form of classic makers. But as Conor said, I mean, the key is, you know, I know we have tons of conversation and discussion about what do you have new that's coming out? What are you guys working on? Boy, I wish you still did this thing, you know, that you did 10 years ago, and you know, that might have been a one-off release. But for me, I mean, I enjoy the fact that we're still making the same mash bill since 1954, and that there's a bar that's set that we have to meet every single day. And so it's great. Like, Conor and I get to, you know, come do things like this, and it's a lot of fun. We get to interact, you know, with our consumer, with the audience. But the reality is we have multiple master distillers that are there every single day. I mean, our distilleries are designed to run 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and obviously we can't be there for that. So a lot of the fun is sharing that passion with the other operators and that story that, hey, this is why we do what we do, and here's the expectation, and then giving them the tools they need to be very consistent in their jobs.
There's greatness within each of us. You just have to look for it. Some find it in the quiet moments, others find it in the company of friends. Our namesake, Elijah Craig, discovered greatness when he first charred oak barrels to make the smooth, rich taste that became known as bourbon. Today, we make our award-winning small batch for those who strive for the best in themselves and in their glass. Discover the greatness within. Elijah Craig Bourbon.
So a lot of people know the bourbon regulations of can't be distilled any higher than 160 proof, can't go into the barrel any higher than 125 proof. Explain why that is. I mean, why were those numbers targeted?
So if you go, Denny touched on this earlier about vodka. I mean, if you go higher than 160, all this stuff we're talking about, wheat and rye and yeast and cuts and all the rest of it, that goes out the window, because you're into essentially vodka, pure alcohol, and which you will cut pure water, both of which are colorless, flavorless, tasteless. What's the fun in that? So topping it at 160, you're forced, as it were, to keep some of that character in, which then in turn forces you to run a good fermentation, because we're going to care about how the yeast performs, because happy yeast make good flavors that will make good distillate. Unhappy yeast make bad flavors that will make bad distillate. And then you touched on it earlier, you put it in a barrel and, you know, some of the sins will be forgiven, but not all of them. So, you know, the barrel one then, you know, one of the characteristics of bourbon is that it's aged in a new charred white oak container, to be specific. You know, the distillate at that point is pretty much, you can't sell it. It's worthless, if you will. The barrel is expensive, so the fewer barrels you put it in, the lower your cost of goods. But, so that would involve, you know, you don't cut it at all, put it in as high proof as possible. But now you're not getting as much wood character per unit whiskey as if there's a regulation on the max. So they're both driven towards whiskey quality. They were written at a time, those rules were written at a time when there was no rules about whiskey quality, and God knows what you got. So, you know, the TTB in their wisdom said, you shall do this, and you shall do this, and it drove quality. So, you know, you can know that, you know, your whiskey was in a good barrel for the right amount of time and had the right exposure to wood, and will have a better chance of being delicious.
And I have yet to see, when I do a distillery tour, anybody going over 140 much at all, right? So nobody really pushes that 160 barrier, do they, very often?
No, I mean, you know, not many that I know of. And I think that's because, I mean, we spend a lot of money on grain, right? I mean, we're basically taking water and grain and turning it into liquid gold. So, you know, a lot of your flavor has to come from that grain. So if you're going to spend all that money on it, put all the time and energy into using it, then why strip more of that flavor out? And so, I mean, we prefer that flavor in our distillate. And if you start getting close to 160, even though that's the reg, it's definitely going to be a little more of a neutral spirit, which we don't necessarily want.
And now, Maker's Mark, if I'm correct, barrels closer to 110 proof?
We go in at 110, yeah.
Why is that? 'Cause that's full 15 proof below.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that when they did the first barrel of Makers, they went in at 110. So, You know, the way we got started with the Samuels, they had a very specific taste vision. They'd been distilling at that point for 6 generations and had admitted that the family whiskey wasn't very good. And so when they decided to start over and founded the Maker's brand, that's when they went to the wheated mash bill. But specifically, it's when they started going in the barrel at 110. So because that toast profile was defined back in the 50s, it allows us to, you know, for us, it's the right ratio between the alcohol and the wood at 110. But as Conor said, I mean, that's if the accountants and the finance people were running the distilleries, like literally running the distilleries, then yeah, we'd be going in at 125, but it wouldn't taste like Maker's either. So I think it's just literally how you get to what you want your whiskey to taste like, and then being able to maintain that. Because if you start cutting corners, you know, 55, let's say we're 66 years in now, all of a sudden we're going to go in at 125, or we're going to stop barrel rotation, or you're making a different whiskey. It's going to taste different. There's not much we can do to mask that. So it's, for us, it's just something that we've done from day one.
You know, Heaven Hill does distill up to 125 in many cases.
We enter at 125.
That's, thank you very much. Talk about which chemicals are having some favor with the barrel at one point, because there's some argument that water has better access to the wood sugars and alcohol has access to other components within the barrel, and there's those trade-offs, you know, water versus alcohol. So why the decision to go to 125, do you think?
I mean, some of it is economics. I mean, on a distillery our size, that's a lot of barrels. We're filling 1,300 barrels a day. But then it also gets back to what I referenced earlier, house style. I mean, we've been making whiskey at, you know, for 85 years, you know, with those characteristics. And again, consumers are loyal. They like what we make. That's why we've been in business all these years. And you know, we've got something good, and we're kind of sticking with it. But you know, what happens in the barrel is, you know, influenced by what proof you go in at. It's influenced by how long it's in the barrel, where it's in the warehouse, where the warehouse is, what style of warehouse it is. So there are a million different levers that you can pull to influence how the whiskey ages out.
Which is how you make so many bourbons from
And that's exactly it.
one recipe.
We've got something like 1.8 million barrels aging right now across 60 warehouses. And
in 6 locations, I think, too.
yeah,
right?
correct. And I mean, we've got our 5 mash bills end up as, I've lost count, it's like 105 or 109 different brands. And you know, that's how we do it. It's like, this one is 6 years old, that one's 12 years old. This one came from these warehouses, that one came from those warehouses. It was up high, it was down low. It had wheat in it, it had rye in it, you know.
So I love talking to a lot of the newer, you guys would be kind of newer in a
New
way.
kids on the block.
Master distillers, new kids on the block. So many at your age range have serious degrees. Like, you are mechanical and you're chemical.
Correct.
I'm biology.
Biology.
Yeah. I wanted to be a marine biologist, Steve. I don't know how the hell I ended up here. I mean,
There's only
I'll
catfish
take
and
it.
bass in Kentucky.
Yeah. My dad told me that for 4 straight years. So yeah.
It worked
That's
out
cool.
okay. It worked out, yeah.
I think it's really interesting to see degreed people in the industry. But my gosh, the guys, the giants upon whose shoulders you're standing, often had no degrees.
Yeah.
Yet they could make fantastic whiskey. First of all, what kind of awe and respect and honor do you hold these guys? I mean,
What's above the highest?
Yeah.
is it pretty cool to meet these self-taught guys?
Yeah, pinch yourself every day. I mean, you know, the people whose, you know, like you said, shoulders we stand on, you know, whose footsteps we follow in. It's like, how the hell did I, growing up in Dublin, end up following Parker Beam, you know? His birthday is next week, I believe, but. So yeah, it's pretty impressive. And you know, you don't necessarily need a degree either in engineering or biology. I mean, it's like, you got to want to make good whiskey. You got to be into it. I mean, that's what sets good whiskey apart from not so good whiskey. Is that the people making it care and are passionate about it.
I think the degree anymore, especially when I started in the industry in '98, it gets you in the door. Like, I started out in the lab, so, but when I was in the lab, I was obsessed with the whiskey making process because we were doing all the testing, analyzing, collecting the data, and I've always been interested in, well, what does that mean? right? So we've got these numbers. So what does that mean? How can we impact it? And so, I mean, you know, it got you in the door, but then once you get in, you know, these guys that have been doing it forever. I mean, you know, my first day, I started out at Jim Beam Claremont, and, you know, run Fred No, right? You know, Fred's working there. I'm talking to him, and then, you know, Booker wasn't involved in the day-to-day, but I was running distillate samples down to Booker probably once a month so that he could taste it, either for what was going to be set aside as Booker's, or he liked to cook with it. And so, I mean, you know, when you're immediately introduced to that, because I think that's the unique thing about this industry is, you know, these people that have been involved a long time are very accessible. It's not like they're behind some wall, you never get to talk to them. I mean, your first couple of days, if you're new, they're probably going to seek you out. You know, they want to talk to you, they want to ask you questions, they want to get to know you, but they're also sizing you up a little bit because they're thinking about, you know, these are generational operations. So, you know, how can they make sure that, you know, these operations are in good hands for when they're not doing the day-to-day stuff. So, I mean, it's incredible to be sitting here today in this industry. It's a lot of luck, but I also think there's a lot of passion involved and, you know, just that desire to want to learn.
And one of your most quoted lines is, I was tired of making paint, right?
No, I'd actually never made paint, but I was always very wary of ending up making paint.
As a chemical engineer,
As
right?
a chemical engineer.
Right. But you're involved in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
I mean,
so we used a genetically engineered enzyme to make the enzyme that's used to make cheese. That was my first chemical engineering. Actually, it was my second chemical engineering job. The first one, I made citric acid, which is pretty close to paint, but it was a fermentation-based process, and it was kind of cool. And then genetically engineered bacteria to make enzyme to make cheese, which is very cool. And you know, then ended up in this business almost 17 years ago now. So. And
you beat on some doors just to, because you thought whiskey making sounded really cool, right?
Yeah, I mean, the almost joke at this point is if I'd ended up going back to Dublin, I thought it'd be cool to get a job making Guinness in Dublin. How cool would that be? And then once I figured out I'm not going back to Dublin, it's like, well, what's here? And this bourbon thing sounds kind of cool. That was in 2002, which was long before any boom, long before anyone. I mean, the person hired into the position that Brown-Forman hired me into had been hired 26 years prior. And I knocked on doors for 2 years before that one opened up. So to get from that point to this, when the industry is as rocking as it is now, it's kind of mind-boggling.
Well, and to give people some perspective, this is also one of my favorite stories about you. Tell people, so you're working at Brown-Forman, it's early times distilleries.
Yeah.
Who were you making whiskey for?
Lincoln Henderson, yeah.
No, I mean, that was your boss.
Yeah, so Glenn Glazer.
What client were you making whiskey?
Oh, that version of it. So yeah, most of it was for Heaven Hill. Yeah, so after the fire, you know, Brown-Forman weren't the only one to rally around, but Brown-Forman offered production capacity to Heaven Hill. And, you know, when I hired in 2004, a lot of the, you know, most of the whiskey we were making was for Heaven Hill. So, you know, there's lots of ways to look at that, but, you know, it's the way I look at it now is like, if it hadn't been for Heaven Hill, then Brown-Forman probably wouldn't have had to hire me. So there's my first debt to Heaven Hill, and then, you know, January 19 they hire me again. So thank you, Heaven Hill, twice. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to wind it up here with an easy question. I mean, we've seen this craft distillery boom going on for about 10 years now, and surely some of that is people correctly or incorrectly romanticizing making whiskey and what a cool job that is, and I would love to make that kind of product. Do they ever seek you guys and, you know, for advice and say, what should I do? How should I get in? And if they don't...
and we always tell them, don't, run away.
Right.
Yeah. Do they ever seek you out for that kind of advice? And if so, what do you tell them?
Yes. So it comes in different forms, whether it's a venture capitalist that's interested and, you know, they're just a whiskey person. But anymore, it's a lot of, you know, kids that are in college, coming out of college, and they're always asking, I get it at least once a week, either an email or a phone call, you know, what's it take to be a master distiller? And so then you start talking about, well, it's not, you know, I know you see the tastings and the travel and all this and that, but I'm like, how do you feel about working back shift, holidays, and weekends? Because we're a manufacturing plant. I mean, we run 24/7. And it's amazing that people really don't think about that. I'm like, so you know, I'm like, I've got people right now in the distillery that have probably worked a back shift for 10 or 15 years. When that first shift job opens up, guess who's getting it? So you have to be prepared to do those things. And it's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice for your family too. You just have to know what you're getting into. Then on the flip side of it is just people most of the time want to know about how much. You know, what's it going to take to start up a distillery? How much money do you think it's going to cost in capital? What are some of the roadblocks we're going to run into right away? And they're all interesting discussions. And most of those people have a lot of money, so it's not too big of a deal for them. But you get it from kind of different angles, people that are interested in craft or just starting something up from scratch.
And they nearly always underestimate how much money it's going to take. I got $1 million. Well,
Triple it.
Yeah,
triple it,
right.
10, put
Easy.
a couple of zeros after it, yeah.
Cas, I've really appreciated your time this afternoon.
good talk,
Hopefully,
thank you.
viewers learned a bit about distilling, and corner to these guys anytime you get the opportunity at a large whiskey event when these things return.
Yeah.
And ask them questions. They are always, it amazes me how much you guys and so many others in the distilling industry will answer questions all day long. It's like y'all love to talk about your job.
Yeah,
so
it's fun, right?
Post them up. They like that kind of stuff.